It's the Don Kroah Show on life-changing talk radio, WAVA.
The Don Kroah Show on WAVA, coming to you again live from CPAC 2014. And we have less than a half hour remaining, but certainly one of the favorite guests that I welcome every time we can, and it's always been by phone. We were able to meet each other in person for the first time. Delighted to have Dr. Zuhdi Jasser here with me. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, AIFD. He's also the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Zuhdi, it's just a delight to have you here in person.
Thank you, Don. Also, it's an honor to be with you in person and shake your hand, and I just love your program. It's always great to be on.
Thank you. And I, along with a lot of our other listeners, appreciate the stand that you have taken as a Muslim to the best interests of the Muslim community, but also America itself. And we need to understand there is a distinction that must be made in Americans' minds as to the radical Islamists and those from the Islamic community who want to harm our country and have done so, and they want everybody to think that that's the view of all Muslims, and you say that's not the case at all.
Absolutely not. And it's unfortunate that most of the groups that claim to speak for our communities are really focused on the victimology, on saying that it's somebody else's fault and that we're the victims. And ultimately, my sense is that this is a Muslim problem that needs a Muslim solution. And my message here on a panel I did yesterday is that it's overdue for, I think, the conservative movement to begin to give solutions for these issues, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Egypt, domestic terrorism, as you saw in Boston and Fort Hood. These all have a common problem. They're the tip of the iceberg of a deeper problem, which is the need for Muslims to reform and modernize the ideas of our faith and to defeat political Islam. That needs America to start to invest in it, not militarily, but ideologically. And just as the conservative movement in the Cold War united behind the idea that socialism and communism was an ideological problem that didn't have a military solution, it's time for conservatives, I think, to add to our lists of issues that are important to us, whether it's big government and making it smaller, a strong defense. The national security paradigm in the 21st century needs to have on its list a consensus among conservatives that political Islam is the problem and Muslims that are anti-Islamist are the solution.
Well, it couldn't be better said. And you speak from a frame of reference that few people have in that, and you've shared it with me before, you're a first-generation American Muslim from Syria. Your parents, in fact, suffered at the hands of a radical Islamist, didn't they? Yeah,
at the hands of the Ba'ath Party and the
right.
Syrian fascists, which were in bed with radical Islam for quite a bit. And we see now with the war, I wish my grandfather was alive to see this, because he, for long, and as my parents left and found freedom in America in the late 60s, they always said, gosh, at some point, as the old philosopher said, every people deserve the government they have. If they were alive, I think my father and grandfather may change that a bit now, and they realize that the price for freedom is the death of hundreds of thousands, the displacement of millions, and it could have been much less if America had not, again, get involved. You don't need to send troops there because there's millions fighting. The bottom line, though, is to give them the means to fight against a government that is not a civil war. They're getting fueled from Iran. There are 30,000 Iranian soldiers in Syria. Russia is bankrolling this war. So at least give those classical liberals, those who want to fight for a democracy, give them a chance. And the more we let that vacuum exist in Syria, the more radicalized the Syrian population is becoming, and the more of a security threat it will be for our ally Israel, and the whole region will destabilize, and ultimately we will have to be involved militarily if we don't try to tip it in the right direction.
And how do you and I have talked about these matters before, not only regarding Syria but Egypt and that whole region, and it's sort of a rhetorical question, but how do you explain an administration and a government here in the U.S. that seems time and again to come down on the wrong side of these issues, we end up, intentionally or not, playing into the hands of the most radical elements of Islam.
This is what happens when you have a president and a leadership of a party that really don't view that America has any role in the world. They're very post-American. They think that ultimately we just sort of, and I'd call, every president has had a doctrine. President Bush, 43, had a freedom agenda in the Middle East. Unfortunately, we didn't do very well in articulating what we were doing other than militarily, but still there was a doctrine. This president's doctrine is just a Darwin. Let the most evil win, the strongest, the ones with the strongest militaries or power will win. We are irrelevant, and ultimately, while President Obama is good at delivering speeches from a teleprompter, his speech in Cairo had some elements in 2009, but we have suffered. If our credibility was in the double digits, in the teens under President Bush, it is now proven to be in the single digits, because they realize that we have one standard at home for freedom, and abroad we just don't care. We don't support anybody, and we're letting the autocrats and the radical Islamists basically ravage and savage Syria. Egypt, we saw, now it's switching. We supported the Brotherhood. I mean, it's just horrific what our president's doing.
And it simply emboldens those of that ilk.
And you can't, Don, you cannot overestimate what's happening in the Ukraine as being directly related to a Russian president that sees that our red lines meant nothing in Syria. Basically, we are on complete opposite sides in Syria, and he's seen that President Obama not only is detached, but is really just lobbing words and not really helping anything on the ground. Even when we said we were going to arm the rebels, it took months and months until they got anything, and it really has been meaningless. And our words to Iran have been meaningless. Russia's been on the Iranian government side. So they say, why not just go into Crimea and do whatever they want?
And, of course, folks, that's the foreign policy side, which we could spend hours talking on in terms of our concerns, as Zuhdi has just so well articulated them. But he and I, most of the time when we've visited, we've talked about what's happening here at home. Mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, and very few people understand, I dare say even now, the implications of that name and its history and what it's doing, not just over there, so to speak, but right on our own soil. And I know that's been one of your driving passions.
It really is. And our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is really about the desperate need to engage American Muslims in fighting this battle. That for long, since the 60s, when the Muslim Student Association, the progenitor of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in America, formed itself, for long they've been the only voice. And it's time for Muslims of all different extractions and ethnic extractions, business extractions, to come together and say they don't represent the only voice. And as we saw in Egypt, you saw 10 million Muslims rise up against the Brotherhood after 1 year. That same diversity exists in America, but because there's no chance of the Brotherhood ever taking over America, you're not going to see them rise to the streets. We're only 1% of the population, but yet we need to put a fire under my co-religionist feet, because the Brotherhood is using America as a platform to change our foreign policy, to allow separation of Muslims from the regular communities through Sharia courts and other things that I think are radicalizing our community, creating the future Boston bombers that exist. And we are not reforming and pushing forth the true treatment of political Islam, which, as Al Jazeera buys networks, a foreign government, Qatar buys for $500 million a network worth 10% of that, and they're on our shores. So for my fellow conservatives who are neo-isolationists, they're on our shores anyway. So this is not about foreign war. It's a domestic conflict, and these organizations take devout Orthodox Muslims like myself and say that we're bigots, we're Islamophobes, because they don't want to deal with the issues.
I was going to say on that latter point, you have spoken out not without pressure and price to you and your family, right?
Absolutely. And one of the chapters in my book is about tribalism, and that, you know, I wish the toughest issue was the ideas and the need to modernize our faith, but the bigger issue is what happens to people that speak up against the leadership. They're told, just last week on Twitter, the head of CARE in L.A. said I was an Uncle Tom. He called me a monkey in Arabic, tweeting these things out. And this is supposedly a civil rights group that abandons Islamic ethics in exchange for punishing somebody who demands criticism and an open discourse about what our community should be focused on whether we should use up our bandwidth about Islamophobia, which I don't even agree exists, versus reform and questioning clerics that are not modern.
A final question for sake of time. Now having labored in this area so long as an American and as an American Muslim, do you sense a shift in the Muslim community, the peace-loving community? In other words, is there an awareness growing and a sense of urgency developing?
There really is. I mean, it's not only the terror incidents, which through our own ADD and media and government we focus and then go away. Muslims are realizing that, especially, for example, in the Syrian community, you can do things in this country that you can't do in countries like Syria that are being just destroyed by militaries. We have the freedom and the need, and they're realizing that America is not supporting Muslims abroad because of this fear of radical Islam. And until we make it clear that we are not only against Assad, but we are against the Brotherhood and the Islamists that create the Al-Qaedas of the world, America is going to remain saying, you know what, we're war weary. We're not going to help any of you guys unless you can show us that you want a third pathway of liberty and you stand against the Brotherhood. And we formed an American Islamic Leadership Coalition that's gaining strength. I've talked to conservatives here about helping us with our anti-Islamist strategic working group to have think tanks from Heritage, AEI, and the Investigative Project and others to come together to try to empower Muslims to have an alternative voice and get media and others to use us as examples that it's not all just one voice that speaks for Muslims.
Let's talk again. So
Anytime.
Good to see you, man. Take care.
Don. Thank you for all you do.
Again, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, AIFD. He's the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith, and website.
AIFdemocracy.org. AIF as in forum, democracy.org.